Hi guys, in the previous video we developed a lightning component that just displayed the hello world string. In this video we will add a data table to this lightning component which displays the list of related contacts. In order to do that, we add two things to our existing lightning component code. We have added an attribute called controller which points to an Apex controller, and we have added an interface host:\has record ID. The Apex controller contains the code or the method that fetches the list of related contacts. Let's take a look at that. This is our Apex controller that we assigned to our component. So if you see here, we have a method called fetch contact list. This particular method takes in the account ID as its argument. The code inside it is very simple. Just write there is a SOQL query which fetches the list of contacts based on the account ID, and then it returns it. The one thing to note here is this one. This is the new annotation @aura_enable. This @aura_enable annotation ensures that this particular method can be called from the Lightning component. If we need to fetch data or do DML operations like insert, create, or update, we always write a Apex controller and a method in the Apex controller which contains the code to do all these operations. And the one thing that we need to remember is the @aura_enable annotation that needs to be added to these methods. So once this is added, this particular method can be called from our Lightning component. Let's add few more code to our component. Now we have added our Lightning data table. This Lightning data table is used to display the list of related contacts. This is a base Lightning component. That means this particular Lightning component has all the styles that the Lightning design system gives us inbuilt. So this particular data table has few attributes. The most important ones are the data and the columns. You see here, for the data attribute, we have assigned the value of the attribute myData. And for the columns, we have assigned the value of the attribute myColumns. So these are the two attributes that we have newly added to our code. The myData is of type object. This particular attribute has the value that is the list of contacts that needs to be displayed in this data table. The myColumns attribute will contain the metadata for the columns, like the names of the columns that we need to display, the API names of the fields that needs to be mapped to these columns, as well as their data type. Now let's fill this myData and myColumns using our code. Actually, as I mentioned before, the myColumns attribute has the metadata for the columns like the label that needs to be displayed, the field name, and the type. So here the field name is the actual API name of the field that we are querying using a SOQL query in our Apex controller. Name, phone, and the email. Now that we have populated the myColumns, the next part is to populate the myData attribute. As we all know, this particular attribute will contain the list of related contacts, that is, the data that gets returned from the fetch contacts list method of the Apex controller. So I've added the code that fetches the list of contacts, that is, which invokes the method of the Apex controller. If you see here, we get a reference to the method of the Apex controller using the code component.get of c colon fetch contact list. This is the actual name of the Apex method that is present in the Apex controller. And we assign it to a variable called action. The next step is something very important. If you see here, we are trying to get the value of an attribute called record ID and storing it in a variable record ID. Until now, whatever attribute that we have used in our code, we have already declared in our component. For example, we have declared message, my data, and my columns. But in this code, we have a new attribute called record ID, which is nowhere declared in our code. So how did we get this attribute? We get this attribute from this interface host colon has record ID. So this interface ensures that we get the record ID of the account that is currently being displayed on screen, so that when the quick action button is clicked, we get the account ID. And once the account ID has been retrieved, it is stored in an attribute called record ID automatically by the framework. So whenever you use this interface host colon has record ID, it automatically sets the attribute record ID with the value of the record ID that is currently on screen. In this line, we set the parameters for our action. The parameters are the input arguments that we pass to this Apex method. Here we are passing the account ID. The key account ID should match the name of the argument in the Apex method. And we pass the account record ID that we got from the record ID attribute as its value. Once that is done, we set the callback function. This callback function runs after all the asynchronous processing is completed. So in this callback function, we have a code to check the state of that response. So if the response state is success, what we do is whatever data we get from the Apex method, we assign it to the myData attribute. We assign value to the myData attribute using the component.set function, and the value that gets assigned is the response.getReturn value. This returns the entire list of contacts that comes as part of the response. Once this is done, the myData attribute is populated with the list of contacts. And this myData attribute is what this Lightning data table uses to fill its table. The last line is the $a.enqueue action method. $a is a namespace and it contains a function called enqueue action into which we pass our action variable. This particular line enqueues the server-side action and it gets invoked once all the JavaScript processing is done. So once this line gets invoked, the framework calls the Apex method, runs this query, returns the list of contacts, and calls this set callback function. Once the set callback function is called, a list of contacts that is returned by the method is assigned to the myData attribute, and that gets rendered on screen. Now, let's check what has happened to our component. So now you can see a data table that has been added, and this data table has the columns that we prepare in our code as well as the data that gets returned from the Apex method. In this video, we saw how to write an Apex method that can be used in the Lightning component using the @ri enable annotation. Also, we learned how to use the Lightning component data table base Lightning component. One thing to notice, all these attributes have multiple data types. You see the documentation. So these are all data types that can be used as type for the attribute. The most frequently used ones are the Boolean, the integer, and string. In the next video, we will see the small filter functionality that was in the demo Lightning component.